Hello everyone and welcome to the BCM Game of the Month for November 2011. This is your host, International Master Andrew Martin, reporting. And the game this month comes from the Bilbao Masters Tournament, a remarkably strong event taking place in Brazil. It's a game between Vasily Ivanchuk playing with white and Hikaru Nakamura playing with black. Of course, to a degree, the news from this event was overshadowed by Ivanchuk's unfortunate incident in Sao Paulo, where he was robbed at gunpoint. We wish him well, recovering from this traumatic incident, and well, you're going to see that it didn't necessarily affect his chess in a negative way, as he obviously got angry and, well, on this particular day, decided to try and rip Nakamura apart. Okay, well, Ivanchuk kicks off with 1e4, and combative as ever, Nakamura responds with the Sicilian. Knight f3, e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now the flexible move, a6. This is actually the Can Sicilian, and differentiates itself from the Paulsen and the Taimanov in that black has not yet developed his knight to c6. In fact, in many of the lines in this system, black's knight often comes to d7, and that's the main difference. This system with black is very solid and can be interpreted in many different ways. So it's the elasticity of black's position that gives its attraction to many strong players. Well, white normally plays bishop d3 here, but Ivanchuk plays knight to c3, black goes queen to c7, and now straightforward development with bishop d3. Black played knight f6, and now here's the first sign that Ivanchuk is in a very aggressive mood, f4. And if black is starting to get worried about white's idea of e5, of course, he could play d6 in this position. But Nakamura is always up for a fight and plays his bishop out to b4. And this is another advantage conferred on black by his move order. If the knight's on c6, there's no direct threat to white's position. Here, the queen and the bishop bombard c3 and force white to think about that square. Well, I don't know whether Nakamura was surprised when Ivanchuk completely ignored black's threat and played knight b3, but this is a very interesting and challenging move. I think black should certainly take up the gauntlet here and take on c3. That's what Nakamura did. And now we come to a really important point in the game, where black can actually grab that pawn on c3. Now let's just take a quick look at this. If he takes on c3, obviously white's going to put the bishop in the way. Black has to retreat his queen, and it's not at all easy to find a good square for the queen. I mean, the queen could come to c7, where she's possibly vulnerable to black squared hits. She could come to c6, and then after that I think white could just continue with perhaps castles, or maybe even queen e2. Either way, white's got a big initiative, and it looks like black has been pawn grabbing in the opening and may well pay for this transgression of opening laws by getting crushed in the early middle game. So that's a very risky capture, the capture on c3. Going back to the game, black in the game decided to play the safe move d6, and Ivanchuk brought his bishop out to a3. So targeting that weak pawn on d6. And again, black can capture on c3. It looks possibly better this time to take on c3, because white can't put the bishop in the way. But what he can do, surprisingly, is offer the exchange of queens. And even in this queenless situation, it's really not that easy for black to nullify white's pressure. Obviously, if white's allowed to take on d6, just like that, he's going to regain the material he sacrificed earlier, and he's going to have two mighty bishops. If black tries to hold his material with d5, this gives white the opportunity to lever open the game. And for instance, after c4, white is working up a real head of steam here. I don't like black's position despite the fact he's a pawn up. He's really lagging in development, and by simple moves white should be able to maintain a strong attack. Grandmasters such as Nakamura are reluctant to allow the opponent a strong attack of this type. But as Nakamura plays, Ivanchuk gets a strong attack anyway. What black's hoping for, of course, is some sort of win in the long haul. You know, white's not able to resolve those weaknesses on the c-file, and black, if he can withstand the initial attack, can look forward to a much better endgame or perhaps taking off that pawn at c3 at a more convenient moment. But by and large, I think most grandmasters would prefer white's position here, simply because he's got the chance of a strong attack against the black king. Well, queen d2 was played, rook d8, shoring up the pawn on d6. White castled, and black just brought his knight out to c6. And now rook f3. Well, that rook is very dangerously placed. The rook can slide along the third rank to either g3 or h3. The rook on a1 can come across to f1. You get the picture. White is ready to throw the kitchen sink at black in this position. Black, meanwhile, has yet to complete his development, and this Nakamura tried to do via b5. But rook g3 started to create some direct ideas, such as, for instance, f5 and then queen across to g5. So black moved his king off the g file. Rook f1. For the time being, it's much easier for Ivanchuk to mobilise his pieces, and now the very direct move f5. In this particular game, Ivanchuk's obviously in no mood to take any prisoners at all. He's just going straight for Nakamura's throat. So rook to g8. Thing is, though, despite the fact, you can look at this position and you might say, well, this black position's bound to cave in within a few moves. I think black's situation is actually not too bad. It's just that when you've got a strong opponent like Ivanchuk coming at you, it's rather intimidating. So you might not find the best moves simply because of that. And secondly, defence in chess is much more difficult than attack. I think black can successfully defend this position, but it is really difficult. And with white transferring all his pieces to the king side at high speed, it's a very intimidating situation. Well, now I think Nakamura probably goes wrong. He plays e5. That closes the position to a certain extent, and black's certainly thinking about going d5 in a moment, which will put pressure on the e4 pawn. But perhaps he should take on f5, a move suggested by Grandmaster Eduard in his excellent notes from the ChessBase website. And the point of this is that after rook takes f5, black is playing the remarkable move queen d8. And if white goes queen h4 in this position, then black puts his knight on e5. That's the holding move which enables black to defend this position. And despite the impressive looking positions of the white major pieces, he's still to find a way through. But yeah, well, e5, a tempting move, going back to the game. Queen h4, and now Nakamura plays knight to e7, hoping to bring his knight over to the defence of the king. But this move probably is bad. What he's got to do here is to play the odd-looking move knight b8 and try to reinforce the knight on f6 via knight d7. For instance, if white goes for it here with rook takes g7, queen takes f6, black can recuperate with knight to d7. Moreover, if white plays rook h3 in this position, then knight bd7, bishop c1, and now pawn up to d5. That's the move black is dying to get in, because it gives him lots of counterplay. And, well, after e takes d6, e takes d5, queen d6, again, white has got to break through. He can't yet get to h7 because the knight on f6 is protected by the other knight, and black is getting ready for serious counterplay in the centre with queen takes d5. But going back to the game, knight e7, rook h3, it gives Ivanchuk the opportunity to show his attacking skill. Alright, d5. Well, Nakamura gets his favoured move in, but this time the position of the knight on f6 is a bit more shaky than it was before. Knight c5. Very tempting move again, bringing the knight, the passive knight on b3, into the fray. But maybe rook f3 is just winning in this position. And the point of this move is that if black plays d takes e4, he gets a very rude shock indeed after the brilliant queen takes h7 check. Knight takes, rook takes, and out of nowhere, white has fashioned a corridor mate. That's an absolutely brilliant variation. Going back to rook f3, well, it may be black can try to defend himself with rook gc8, but then white's going to go bishop takes e7 and then g4. This is going to be a very, very difficult attack to withstand, as white is powering through. And after queen f8, which is probably the only move, I quite like rook fg3. Black might be able to defend this position, but as you can see, it is exceptionally difficult. White is threatening to rip open the position immediately, and the black king looks rather lonely. Anyway, Ivanchuk, you can understand why he, going back to the game, brings that knight into c5. He wants to introduce every last piece into the attack. Black plays d takes e4, bishop takes e4. Bishop comes to d5. Of course, capturing on e4 is not allowed, really, because of the weakness of h7. And now g4. All of white's pieces seem to be very well coordinated now. Black went h6. White pushed on with g5, and by analogy to a previous variation, white now pushes home with f6. Now this might look a little bit risky here, because black's got a rook on g8 and white's king is still on the g file, but I don't think there's any way for black to take advantage of that. Nakamura tried rather forlornly to block the g file with knight g6, but once again white tries to rip open the position with f takes g7. Now it may be, as pointed out by Edouard, that queen g4 is a better move in this position, and the idea of this is to take on g7 next move and then go rook takes h6. But you can see that Ivanchuk is frothing at the mouth here. He just wants to smash open the king. F takes g7, rook takes g7, and now queen takes h6. But maybe even here, in this very precarious looking situation, Nakamura can still defend himself. He went rook d8, bishop takes g6, compelling black to take with a pawn. Rook f6, queen c8, and now rook h4, preventing a check on g4. Bishop f7. Okay, well, maybe black was running into serious time trouble here, but it seems that bishop g8 holds the position. And the point of this is that if white goes rook takes g6 here, black is right on time with his counterplay. The rook comes into d1, bishop comes up to d5, and now maybe even black wins. So in the middle of this undulating struggle, black might have missed something here. Anyway, bishop f7, knight d3 was played, king g8, and now the bishop comes into d6. I imagine these moves were played at quite high speed because, well, it's a very sharp and dangerous position. e4 was played by black, bishop e5, finally he managed to get the bishop in as well, rook d5, and now the decoy move, rook c6, threatening the queen and checkmate on g7. Black protects the rook on g7, bishop takes g7. Of course, black would have also had insuperable problems after rook c8 here. But bishop takes g7 in the game, queen takes g7, and now it's much simpler. White resorts to just taking material off the board. Rook takes g5, queen takes g5, a lovely way to finish. In comes the rook check. If the king goes to the h file, rook h4, bishop e8, check, king goes to h7, and once again rook h4 check terminates proceedings. Well, that's the type of spectator-friendly chess that Ivanchuk has been playing in Bilbao, and he certainly is a crowd-pleasing as well as a tremendous attacking player. But full credit to both players there for giving their all in this entertaining struggle.